Good morning. This is a nice big room. I like it. Thank you. Thank you for coming out to hear me this morning. This is my first visit to Australia, and it's been really amazing, just mind-blowing. I feel bad that I hadn't come here before, and I certainly will return many times. I was able to visit Melbourne just before this weekend and gave a talk there, and also arrived just in time to see two of the women's singles matches, and saw my countrywoman Serena Williams ascend to the finals, and that was really exciting. So had wonderful seats, third row, the sort of thing that I could never accomplish at the U.S. Open, which I've tried, but you can't get that close. And then I arrived here before the weekend, and I had the pleasure of attending the Asian Cup final, and so you might have to thank me for the Socceroos' victory. I certainly played some small part in it. I did buy a jersey and a scarf and was there to cheer them on. So having no previous affiliation, I just thought I should go with the crowd. But it was a wonderful experience, and I've enjoyed your beaches over the weekend as well. Got to watch my Super Bowl, and unfortunately my wife's team won, my daughter's team lost, so I have to go home to that sort of tension. But anyway, it's thrilling to be here. It's thrilling to be part of this conversation. My visits to library conferences around the world are always the most fulfilling and most enjoyable part of my job. And I bring good news today, actually. I bring good news, and you'll see why I'm excited and bullish about the future of libraries, and just as importantly, the future of librarianship around the world. My president used the phrase mindless austerity yesterday. Well, I can't tell if it's yesterday. I'm still not sure how the time works. But sometime in the last 24 hours, he used the word mindless austerity as he introduced his budget proposal for the United States and made it clear that the dominant vision of the involvement of state funding for public goods and public works can no longer work. We've gone too long with this sort of idea that by squeezing the public sector, we can actually improve life around the world. We have too many pressing problems. Now, I don't want to give him too much credit. He actually was part of the mindless austerity for a number of years as well, certainly a party in it. But we've seen elections in Greece, a little election in Australia a few days ago as well, seem to indicate that the mood is changing, the conversation is changing at least. It's going to be a long process to try to recapture the notion that public institutions such as libraries and universities should not wither on the vine, and that, in fact, disinvestment in those institutions is in no one's best interest. I don't have to convince you of that, but nonetheless, we clearly have to continue to convince the general public and our leaders of that. We've been in the library community and in the university community on the defensive for at least 15 years, I might argue for 30 years. We've been on the defensive because of not only these problems with political ideology, but on the defensive because we have been miscast as being old fogies. We've been miscast as being on the slow side of technological innovation, a position one can hold about librarianship and universities only out of ignorance, out of willful ignorance, of course. We should recognize, as I often tell people, that we would not even have Google if it were not for librarianship. The problem that Sergey Brin and Larry Page were trying to solve when they founded Google, when they founded their algorithm that became the core of Google, was a librarianship problem. They saw a collection of documents, in this case, pages on this new thing called the World Wide Web, that was growing at a remarkable rate, that had no obvious method available for organization. It was a huge problem to be solved. It was the sort of problem that people involved in library and information studies for decades had been thinking through, and they came up with a breakthrough, a rather brilliant breakthrough, as a method. Not the final answer, perhaps, not the total answer, but an answer that made this remarkable collection of documents largely navigable. Now, They didn't do it perfectly. They didn't do it in a way that solved all of the problems, certainly. Nonetheless, if it were not for the field of librarianship, we would not have Google. But somehow that got twisted into, because we have Google, we don't need librarianship. Now, some version of that phrase, and I reduced it terrifically, but some version of that phrase has been in common currency around the world as long as we have had Google. And I don't necessarily blame the folks who run Google. I don't necessarily blame the people who work at Google. I think there have been moments when their arrogance has certainly done us no favors. But in fact, the problem was the assumption that because stuff is so quickly findable, and because that stuff seems to satisfy what we thought we wanted in almost any circumstance, from settling bar bets to predicting the weather or figuring out how to walk the streets of Sydney, because those problems were so easily solved by this ubiquitous, easy-to-use, seemingly free system, we in general, not we in this room, but we, the people of the world, have been too quick to assume that our problems of information access had been solved. That's been the case, I don't need to tell you, for the last 15 years or so. As long as Google's been around, as long as Google's been part of our thought process, there's been an assumption that that problem had been solved. And I have heard directly from people who are in charge of, for instance, helping to fund universities and helping to fund libraries, that libraries and librarianship need not operate along the same values and practices and sense of professionalism anymore because we have algorithms that do that job. Now, this familiar trope of technological replacement of human judgment should bother us, but it's something we've been dealing with for about 300 or 400 years, and that's not necessarily where we need to dig. Nonetheless, I'm happy to report that Google is no longer Google, in the sense that the Google we knew and we've grown up with for the last 15 years, or it's grown up with us for the last 15 years, is no longer the same company. It is no longer the company whose core mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. Now let me see if I can advance these slides. Do I have a device? Is this the device? This must be the device. There we go. Okay. So I wrote this book called The Googleization of Everything. It came out a few years ago. As with any book about anything that technological or that fast-moving, I sure wish I could publish it today. Many of the points I made in the book are actually more relevant, more powerful today. There's a moment in the book when I try to convince people how important it is that we have stiff regulations limiting what companies like Google can do with our personal information, because after all, it's all too easy for the state and various illiberal states around the world to capture that information. And of course, the way I expressed it was largely speculative, and now we know for the last 24 months or so, we know that it was not speculative, that such projects have actually been a core of security policy in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, in Australia, and in much of the world, not just in places like the People's Republic of China, which we should all be concerned about. Basically, I wanted to make the case that Google's way of doing things, Google's way of thinking about itself, Google's way of organizing itself, has been steadily working on so many different areas of life, chiefly communication, knowledge, or what qualifies as knowledge, and our identities, our sense of ourselves, our sense of place in the world. So this was the core theme of the book. That is still true, perhaps more true than ever. Just this morning I read that Google is launching a service to compete with Uber and Lyft for car shares. In other words, it will provide the platform for people to offer up their automobiles for short-term transportation. It's a way that Google is clearly moving away from any sense that it is chiefly an information company, but in fact is trying to Googleize everything in the entire world. Now, this has been Google's mission statement since its founding, since 1998, since Page and Brin were graduate students at Stanford. So consider that for a second. A couple of graduate students from Stanford thought that this should be their new company's mission in life. That is a stunning statement. That is a tremendously arrogant statement. They actually have done a remarkable job working toward it, but it should alarm us. The first time I saw this statement written, as I was doing the early research on my book, my first reaction was, who asked you guys? You know, what a presumptuous goal. After all, it is the world's information, it's not yours. And what do you mean to organize? To organize is not a neutral term. To many people it may strike them as a neutral term, but to those of us in this room, we know it's not a neutral term. To decide one thing is more relevant than another, to decide that one thing is higher quality than another, is a fraught decision, one that should not be made quickly, perhaps not always algorithmically. Sergey Brin, at one point in an interview, was asked, what would the perfect search engine be like? And his response was, it should be like the mind of God. And when I read that, I knew I had to write a book about this company, because that's a fascinating position to take in life, that is your goal, to be like the mind of God. That's blasphemous, first of all. But putting that aside, it's stunning that was the vision that this young man had at that moment. And that's fascinating, that's interesting, it's troubling. It's not something I think we should get worked up about, but it certainly begs for more investigation, which is why I jumped into it. By the way, this is a Google image search of the mind of God, in case you ever wondered what it looked like. So what really got me going, though, on this project was the Google Book Scanning project, which was announced in late 2004. It had actually begun more than a year earlier in secret. You might remember these days, late 2004, oh my gosh, a decade ago. Google, which was then a 6-year-old company, announced it was going to scan the entire book collection of the University of Michigan Library. It was going to scan substantial portions of the libraries of Stanford University, Harvard University, the New York Public Library, and Oxford University. A 6-year-old company was basically approaching these esteemed universities with hundreds of years of history, with billions of dollars sunken into their collections. And they said, why don't you give us unfettered access to your collections? Let us choose what parts of your collections we will scan. Let us build a system that will benefit us, right? Because Google's not going to do anything that doesn't benefit itself. And that'll be it. We will let you have digital copies of the scans in some format, as long as you don't make them publicly available, because that should all be done through Google. But basically, a 6-year-old company approached the University of Michigan and said, we, not you, should be the custodians of all of those documents, of all of those centuries of human expression. They said it to Oxford. They said it to Harvard. And the presidents of these institutions, in many cases the library directors of these institutions, said, sure, please, come do it. And the project spread from there to the point where now there are nearly 100 institutions around the world contributing documents to the Google Books project. But the Google Books project, which started out, at least it was described initially as being something close to a universal library, actually does not operate that way anymore. The whole process of scanning and attracting new collections has slowed. The interest that the founders and the top level of Google has had in the Google Books project is no longer very strong. You may have noticed there have been no innovations to the platform. The blog attached to the program, which was very active between 2004 and 2010, has barely been, I don't think it's been updated since 2012 at this point. It's actually been, the entire project has largely been pushed to the side as Google has moved on to other things. But we remember And what happened at that moment to me was I thought, oh my gosh, how crazy is it that this 6-year-old company is going to assume this much control? Because its ubiquity in our lives, of course, gave it cultural power that none of those universities had. And yet those universities had the expertise. Those universities had the sense of professionalism. Those universities had library staffs committed to things like user confidentiality, deeply important. Had staffs committed to high quality scans that would serve the purpose of preservation and not just access. And as we've seen, if you've spent any time using the Google Book service, this comes up a lot. What I love about this is that it reminds people of the human element in the whole process, right? These are not mysterious machines operating on their own to scan in all this material, but actual human beings turning pages, placing books down on this machine. And these aren't elves, these are actual human beings. And occasionally there's an error. And of course, Google asks us to report errors, and they can go into their collection and find a better replacement for the page or perhaps rescan it. Nonetheless, it's a lovely reminder that human beings are part of this entire system. And the demystification of these systems, I think, is something that should be on all of our minds. It should actually be part of all of our agendas as we deal with people we are guiding and people we are educating. The demystification of these complex technological systems is imperative. We have to make sure that people do not take these systems for granted. We have to make sure that people do not take these systems as mystical, magical, deific, despite what Bryn would like us to think about the perfect search engine. We have to remind people that human beings make decisions at every point, that human beings are fallible, that human bodies are involved, and that human bodies are fragile. That's an ethical imperative that all of us have when we deal with these systems. Now, Google has long asserted its benevolence. Google has long used, in some ways promoted, its unofficial mission statement, don't be evil. Now, don't be evil actually started as an internal memo, an internal guide for the engineers who worked there. Because many of those engineers, in the early days especially, could have worked at the biggest, richest, most powerful firm in the world at that time, Microsoft. And so don't be evil actually means don't be Microsoft. If you remember in the late 1990s and early aughts, Microsoft was the big bad company. It was the company that had engaged in rather egregious antitrust or anti-competition policies. It had bullied lots of other software developers. It had fought open source projects at every chance it got. It had no interest in the environment that encouraged open collaboration, such as the World Wide Web. And so to work at Google instead of Microsoft was to make a choice. I'm working to make the world better. And people who work at Google deeply believe that the work that they do makes the world better, makes the world more efficient, makes food taste better, whatever it is. They firmly believe, and they're sincere about it, and I don't doubt their sincerity, that what they do improves something about our life, or they truly believe that it does. Now, the problem with taking that as your core value when you go to work, and I understand needing to do that, but the problem with taking that as the core value of your company, of yourself as you interact with that company, is that there is a fine line between believing that you will do no evil or won't be evil and that you can do no wrong. And that, we've seen time and time again, has sort of shocked and woken up people at Google as they've been accused of and investigated for privacy violations and competition problems. But this notion of universal knowledge, which has guided Google from the beginning and certainly informed the book scanning project, which, as you may know now, is basically a digital bookstore. It resembles Amazon a lot more than it does any national library. But this dream of universal knowledge is, of course, old, deep, important. It drives many of the conversations that we have about what we do and what we might do and what our technologies allow us to do. There have been dystopian visions of it, from the stories of Borges, for instance. There have been utopian visions of it. My university was founded by Thomas Jefferson, so I'm contractually obligated to put pictures of Thomas Jefferson in all my presentations. But the Library of Congress in the United States, which explicitly merely serves Congress, also serves, at least in the United States, as a temple to this vision of universal knowledge. It is supposed to try its best to accumulate everything it can. It doesn't make it universally accessible in all cases, but nonetheless, it's a temple toward that vision. Now, you were probably part of the conversation 15, 20 years ago as we started to realize what these platforms could do for us, that we actually could get to the point where we could provide a substantial amount of information, perhaps not universal, to a substantial portion of the world's population, perhaps not universal, but we could do more than we ever thought we could do before because the marginal cost of information delivery was dropping quickly. The marginal cost was dropping quickly, and it continues to drop. And we had these technologies that allowed for instantaneous publishing, that allowed for remarkably powerful linking of documents, that we had very sophisticated metadata emerging that allowed for all sorts of rich conversation. What an exciting time it's been for the last 20 years as we realize that these problems that librarians 50 years ago didn't even realize were problems because they couldn't even imagine that there was a possible solution. But these problems were easily fixable, cheaply fixable. And that we actually might get to the point where we could connect the majority of people on the globe to the majority of high-quality information. Perhaps not perfectly, perhaps not without blowback, anger, controversy, copyright lawsuits, all sorts of nasty stuff. But along the way, we actually might have that as a vision. But Google actually undermined that effort. It undermined that effort by crowding out the energy. There was a nascent conversation in the mid-1990s. It was not just among librarians, it was among many other people, that these technologies, properly deployed, properly governed, could lead us toward that vision of universal knowledge access. But Google stepped in with its bold vision, its big words, and its billions of dollars, and it took all of the air out of the room. Actually, to be more specific, it took all of the money out of the room. There were a lot of projects around the world, partially funded by foundations, partially funded by states, that evaporated almost immediately as Google announced its book scanning project. I was part of a few of these efforts, and it was stunning how quickly funders ran from any notion of a publicly available digital collection system. And it would be 5 or 6 years until anyone could make a serious move in another direction. So is this the best we can do? Can we merely say, well, look, Google is so ubiquitous, so powerful, so rich, let's just be happy we have it, and we have everything it gives us. And that's not a bad conclusion. Better is better. And we certainly have a better information ecosystem in many ways than we did 15 or 20 years ago. But it's certainly not the best we can do. First of all, the notion that Google makes decisions, favors one document over another, is increasingly based on context that is not always appropriate. Context that is commercially driven. So, for instance, if you use Google enough, and I'm sure you do, you probably understand that Google tends to focus its results to satisfy what you've already told Google you're interested in. That, of course, means that Google saves you a lot of time, and it has become very good for shopping and not so good for learning. Now, Google has made adjustments to that in recent years. In the past 3 or 4 years, it's actually decided that it should favor certain sources that it deems to be high-quality sources, mainstream newspapers and magazines, for instance, and favor those in search results. And it has long favored Wikipedia in search results for many topics. Now this is a clear, straight-up editorial decision that the engineers at Google have made, and they've baked it into their algorithm. Yet they would never describe it that way, but that's essentially what's happened. But what I want to propose is something that basically leaves Google behind. Because I'm pretty sure that Google, the Google of 2025, will look nothing like the Google of 2015, just as the Google of 2015 looks nothing like the Google of 2005. Well, maybe it looks like it upon first glance, but it's not the same company. Google has, for the most part, abandoned its mission statement to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. It is now on a different path, and that path is not to be the operating system of the World Wide Web. That was perhaps its goal of 2000. It's not even to be the operating system of the phone in your pocket or your purse. That was its goal of 2010 and 11. Now, Google's mission statement, Google's true mission, is to be the operating system of our lives. Google wishes and is in the process of trying to make happen a world in which almost everything is connected to a flow of data. Almost everything in our lives would produce data, would interpret data, would react to data, would be part of feedback loops, would therefore be, as they say in the industry, smart. That means making sure that your clothes produce and react to data, perhaps adjusting the temperature. That your wristwatch, or if you have a wristwatch anymore, that your glasses, a project Google was big on 3 or 4 years ago, is now putting to the side, that your automobile is all subject to the flows of data, that your refrigerator is subject to flows of data and therefore can tell you right away that, oh, you're getting low on milk, you might want to stop by and get some milk. That sort of project to become the operating system of our lives is a big vision, and it explains so much of what Google is doing now. And so scanning books is really low down on their set of priorities now, but producing a self-driving car is very high on their set of priorities right now, or at least showing that it can be done. And then embedding data flows in the cars we already have. That's its real short-term goal right now. And their argument is, of course, if we take these messy human beings out of the system, we might actually get safer and more efficient transportation. Not untrue, but there are so many other externalities that we have to deal with and we haven't necessarily thought through. And this never enters the realm of public policy until it's way too late, because the big, powerful company decides that we shall have this. And that's the situation we're in. So we actually, as citizens, have to decide whether we want to allow this company or Microsoft or Facebook or Apple or any number of other companies vying for this, perhaps Samsung, to become the operating system of our lives, because they're all after the same goal. They may not all compete directly for dollars today, but they're all after that project. So putting that aside, letting them play in their playground, I have a whole other talk about that, by the way. We can go on forever about the operating system of our lives. But talking about the Human Knowledge Project, we, in this business, I'm an educator and you're librarians, we actually have a different potential. And that is to envision a coordinated set of efforts that satisfy the core values of, or bring to fruition the core values of librarianship, and actually achieve some of, or hope to achieve, some of the goals of the Enlightenment. So building a human knowledge project doesn't necessarily mean building an entire single infrastructure from the top down. When I say human knowledge project, I actually mean a vision more than a project. It should have been the human knowledge vision, but that doesn't actually sound as good. But the human knowledge project to me is a coordinated set of efforts around the world to standardize and share digital information, but it doesn't stop there. Of course, it should not undermine the efforts of our fine vendors who do so much good work. In fact, much of what we can do with this sense, this vision of a human knowledge project, involves public domain works, involves works that are being collected by local history societies, local archives, and certainly works that should be shared under different circumstances. But ultimately, the private publishing world should be involved in these conversations very deeply. Now, I have a model for this, and the model is the Human Genome Project. You might remember in the 1990s, mid-1990s, let's go back to the early 1990s, genomic scientists around the world were operating in a very competitive fashion, using different techniques to try to annotate the human genome. They saw this as a project that had actually started in the 1980s. They saw it as a 30-year project. The technologies they were using were very steady and deliberate and not fast, but they were doing the job. And then along came a company called Celera. Celera was founded by a super smart scientist who had a grand vision for himself and others. His name was Craig Venter. And Celera had this technique called shotgunning that would significantly accelerate the process of identifying sections of the human genome and facilitating annotation of it. So Venter went around to governments of the world and said, hey, you guys can stop funding human genome science. I've got this. I will take care of it. I'm going to do it faster than your publicly funded scientists can do it. The deal is Celera, as a private company, will offer this information up to researchers and pharmaceutical companies as long as we get what are known as reach-through patents, so that if any developments come out of it that facilitate treatments, Celera gets some money on the back end. That was the model for Celera. But of course, all of those patents would be held by Celera. So this sounds a lot like what Google did with the Books Project. Google said, hey, everybody, don't worry about all these grand schemes of book digitization and public information. We've got this. We'll do it cheaper, faster than anybody could imagine. We'll offer it up under very restrictive terms back to the public. But ultimately, we will control the show. And the assumption is, of course, on Google's behalf, we're going to be around forever. That has to be the assumption. Otherwise, why would you put Google in charge of this? Well, as it turns out, when Celera announced this in the late 1990s, the scientists of the world said, hell no, we're not going to put up with that. And they approached their own governments, and they approached each other, and they coordinated their efforts. So while there had been separate and distinct genome projects in Japan and France, in the UK, in the US, and in other countries, quickly the global labs decided to coordinate their efforts, and they asked for more funding from their governments, and they got more funding from their governments. They made the case that this information was too important to be privatized. And they ended up tying Celera, essentially. In 2001, January 2001, both Celera and the Public Human Genome Project published simultaneous articles in Science and Nature declaring the annotation to be largely complete and open for business, essentially. And since then, genomic science has continued in fits and starts, but nonetheless, it shows that the public project could be just as powerful, efficient, and effective as the private project, that the private project still survives and thrives. It's not going anywhere. And so with this in mind, there's no reason why a public vision should not continue. Now, of course, we need to emphasize that a global collection and coordination effort like the Human Knowledge Project, it should not just be about digitizing documents. It should be about fostering new creation, new expression, and that expression could be in a variety of different forms. It could be software, it could be games, it could be video, it could be sound, and that having a sense of openness and ubiquity to this project should encourage people who, for instance, are doing local histories or local oral histories to deposit their materials under the umbrella of the Human Knowledge Project so that their work is easily accessible and cared for and preserved under the practices and values of global librarianship. These are some of the goals and values that I hope we can put forth under such a project. They're not unfamiliar to you, of course. These are some of the players I would like to see involved. And of course, the real effort here is not just to provide something virtual. We already have things virtual. We already have the Internet Archive, for instance, which is a brilliant effort. It has some search problems, but it's a brilliant effort to collect so many of the elements of the World Wide Web and other digital elements, including now software and games, that are soon to be lost to history. We should all be grateful the Internet Archive exists, of course, but it needs help. It not only needs more money, it needs better coordination and better technology, especially search technology. But the idea here is libraries have long been temples of republicanism. They've long been the places where citizenship could be forged, where local knowledge could be cultivated, where community could be built. But they can be more than that. They can actually be hubs of cosmopolitanism as well. This is from the Google image search for cosmopolitan. So by that I mean that we have the potential to have the network of libraries connected to a system like the Human Knowledge Project serve the interest of not only embedding citizens in their local communities, which has long been done very successfully, but also having an explicit connection to a global conversation about global problems and challenges, human migration, climate, to name two. Now here's the key. The Human Knowledge Project is not virtual. It is actual. It is physical. It is human. It's about valuing these buildings and the people who work within these buildings. It's about investing more in these buildings and the people who work in these buildings. It's about valuing the skill sets and the local knowledge that they bring. That has to be front and center. We have had a number of conversations in the United States as we've put forth visions for digital collections. A number of questions raised, issues brought forth by people who work in the local public library world, that the development of a nationally available digital collection will only serve to undermine the case for local collections. And so what we've tried to do in the United States is head off that argument by saying, no, what we're going to provide is, of course, access to things that a local library could not otherwise get, but doubling down on this project. Now, you're probably familiar with your own Trove project. I think Trove is a perfect example of the sort of things we should be building around the world. Trove collects a variety of different materials. It serves as a sort of universal search system. It's really well designed. I played around with it a lot over the last few days. And it does so much of what I hope library systems around the world can start to build. But of course, Trove is a national project. It's working very closely with other similar projects around the world. The reason I know anything about Trove is not just that, hey, I'm going to Australia, I better find out what they're doing, but because I work with the Digital Public Library of America, I'm on their board. And the Digital Public Library of America was a vision that Robert Darnton, the director of libraries at Harvard, had. He had it actually before he directed libraries at Harvard. He's, you probably know, an esteemed esteemed historian of the French Revolution and the history of the book. And when he moved to Harvard to become the head of libraries, Harvard had entered this deal with Google. He wasn't allowed, because he was under a non-disclosure agreement, to tell people what he really thought of this deal. But as soon as the non-disclosure agreement had expired, he started telling people what he thought. And he thought the Google deal was really bad. And he thought that we really needed a public option, a public version of a digital collection like the collection that Google was trying to build so sloppily. And so he envisioned this Digital Public Library of America. A number of other people working with him, some other academics and many important librarians, and Brewster Kaler, who runs the Internet Archive, gathered and decided that we could do this. And we have been raising foundation money and collecting partnerships around the country to try to form a portal, which looks a lot like Trove. It's probably not accidental. And what we have here is, of course, local libraries, historical associations, and local archives contributing their digitized collections to this universal search system. And we have, we are able to, the Digital Public Library is able to facilitate scanning projects if a local collection does not have the technology or the human hands to do it at that moment. We can facilitate that. We can help with that. All sorts of different ways. We offer all sorts of different ways of exploring these sets of collections and working across these collections. It's really a sort of a brilliant research tool, and there's a tremendous amount of buzz about it, and we're getting a tremendous amount of support. But again, it's all funded by foundations. There is no state support for it right now. We hope that there will be at some point. And, you know, basically making it up as we go along. And it is about America. It is the Digital Public Library of America. And so it is, I see it as an element, but a mere element of the Human Knowledge Project. So here are some of the curated exhibits that we have working on the Digital Public Library of America. It's been a lot of fun working on this project. And the great thing is I don't actually have to do any work. I just have to, because I'm on the board, I sit back and go, oh, very nice. You know, I like that. So, and I get to go to all our meetings and meet all the cool people who are doing this work. So these are some of the content hubs. These are some of the groups that are providing content. And you'll notice some of them are actually shared with Google. So there's a sort of non-exclusive deal that Google enforces on, or doesn't enforce on its partners, which is nice of Google. And of course, we have these service hubs, local collections that allow access to this as well. And so the idea here in the model is that throughout the United States, there are information ponds, local historical associations, for instance, feeding into statewide collections, feeding into the national collection, the DPLA. And ideally, people will build on these collections. They will use open map systems, or maybe even Google Map systems, and lay across some other information they can gather out of the DPLA, or other ways they can build. There's an open API that people can use to build new exhibits and collections using this stuff. All right, so where are we with this, and why am I so bullish about this? Well, not only am I bullish because of what I said up front, that I sense that this isn't a futile vision. It isn't a futile vision anymore. It might have been. Actually, if I gave this talk 3 or 4 years ago, I would be less optimistic about its fruition. But I always said at the time, we need to make this case anyway. Look, we've long had the technology that makes it possible to eliminate the gap, eliminate the difference in access to information between people who live in wealthy nations and poor nations, or poor people who live in wealthy nations and rich people who live in wealthy nations. We've long had the technological ability to do that. What we have lacked is the political will to do that. If we truly believe that sharing information, spreading information can enhance human happiness and well-being, if we truly believe that, then we have no excuse for failing to commit to the political effort it would take to realize that. If we don't actually believe that, then fine. Let's go off and do something else. Let's build more sports stadiums. I enjoy them. You enjoy them. Why not? But I happen to believe that we're pretty close to being able to improve the information ecosystem for everybody. Maybe not equally anytime soon, but we can do a lot better than we have done for the last 5 or 6 centuries. We're actually pretty lucky in that sense. And it's not going to take that much. Maybe 3 or 4 sports stadiums, and we could fund this thing, right? I know it's a lot to ask. This would get a big applause in Brazil, by the way, if I said that. So At this moment in time, it's our job to figure out, first of all, how to increase investment in our local projects and our national projects that can feed into a human knowledge project. The Human Knowledge Project need not be something orchestrated from the top. But if we enhance collaboration across borders and oceans in our library projects, if we coordinate our political efforts to maximize funding, if we coordinate our arguments about the deep core values of libraries and librarianship, if we emphasize that, as we now know, the core value of librarianship to protect privacy and user confidentiality has never been more clear, and therefore we should not allow the private sector to run away with this vision and this goal. If we can do that in a global sense, we have a chance. It's not going to be enough. It's a necessary but insufficient move toward what could ultimately be a better global information ecosystem. Now, let's say I live another 50 years. It'd be lovely if I did. I'd be pretty old. But let's say I live another 50 years. If I look back and say, did we get a human knowledge project or not? I don't care. Because this is merely a vision and organizing principle. It's not a to-do list, right? There's no step-by-step agenda. But there are, within it, certain policy agenda items that we should follow through. Making sure that copyright does not impede the global flow of information as it has been. Making sure that copyright policy is not done in the dark as it has been in recent years, as the copyright industries have figured out that there are a lot of us on the outside who care deeply about copyright and might actually raise some objections to open legislation. The copyright industries have been using treaty negotiation in secret to force through some rather draconian copyright restrictions. And of course, we have to do our best, globally, not just locally, to enhance privacy protections for people, to encourage and ensure freedom of information, freedom of speech, freedom of thought. So we need a very straightforward political agenda on those matters. But more than that, we need to understand that we should no longer be cowardly. We should be bold. We have the argument. We have the data. We have the information, and we have the vision for a better world on our side. The challenges facing our world right now are not local, but our concerns and our activism should be and can be and must be. It's local librarians who know what each community needs, whether the community needs more information about irrigation and soil treatment, or the community needs more information about computer software. But it is a set of global communities, all of us, who need to know more about what we might do to address problems and challenges that flow across borders and oceans. So we can't be bystanders. Those of us who are educators and librarians have to be on the front lines of these challenges. And as I said, we may never get a human knowledge project, but it really doesn't matter. As long as we keep these values in mind, as long as we keep these goals clear, as long as we keep fighting and never cower, we at least have a shot. Thank you very much.